Welcome to History 339, History of China, Week 2. We had left off talking about the Song Dynasty, which ruled from 960 AD to 1279 AD, and it was very well known for porcelain. And the kind of porcelain that China made gives the name actually to what we call China, or porcelain. This is actually a photograph of a porcelain pillow. And you may say it doesn't look very comfortable or look like a pillow, but actually you would have put your neck on this part and then reclined on it. The Song Dynasty, unlike the Tang Dynasty, which had established the equal land system, the land equalization system, where it tried to take, a census and every so often redistribute land so that, things didn't get out of kilter or out of harmony in terms of the peasants. The Song Dynasty did not even attempt to establish an equal land system or land equalization system. Well, not surprisingly, the noblemen, the aristocrats, their landed estates continue to increase in size. The peasants were under a lot of pressure for taxation, etc. By the end of the 10th century, literally by the end of the 900s, it's estimated that over 1/3 of the peasants were tenant farmers, meaning they did not own their own land. By the middle of the 11th century, that is by the 1000s, the figure had risen to well over 1/2 of the peasants were tenants, and perhaps as many as 70% of them were tenant farmers. And of course, this meant that the remaining peasants had, it was even more difficult for them. The economy, the dynasty began to lose tax income since the large landed estates of the wealthy people were largely exempt from taxation. It's not surprising that peasant rebellions occurred and the Song Dynasty toppled in 1279. Well, it toppled because of those economic problems, again, implosion, a weakening at the center, but also strengths from the outside. And that's where we come to the Yuan or Mongol dynasty, which ruled from 1279 to 1368. The Mongols were a nomadic people, and they inhabited the steppes north of China and south of Lake Baikal. And you recall the last week I spoke of the steppes as areas of short grasses, which went all the way from Eastern Europe and spread all the way over Eurasia, north of China, through Mongolia into Manchuria. And it was out of the steppes that the Mongols came. They were a nomadic people. The founder of their empire was Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, with his descendants, created the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that time, stretching from Eastern Europe over Russia, Persia, Mongolia, and eventually China and Korea. Mongol forces conquered Beijing as early as 1227 AD. In 1260, Kublai Khan, one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan, moved his capital from Karakoram in Mongolia to Beijing, what we used to call Peking, right? Beijing in China. And he rebuilt the city and renamed it Tatu. Kublai completed the conquest of southern China by AD 1279, the beginning of the Yuan or Mongol dynasty, and he had a beautiful summer palace built at Chengdu. That palace would later be described by Marco Polo and called in the Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem of many, many years later, Kublai Khan, it would be called Xanadu. The Mongol Empire was a trading empire. It was during this time that the Venetian trader, that is, he was from Venice in Italy, Marco Polo, came to China during this time period and may have learned all about, noodles and spaghetti there. Who knows? Don't know. What we do know is that corruption, heavy taxation, and natural disasters brought about the end of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty, in AD 1368. I love this map of the Mongol Empire. because if you look at it, it shows all of the important other empires of this area of the day. The Mamluk Empire down here in Egypt, you see the Byzantine Empire. You, of course, see India, Tibet, and so it's and then, of course, over here is Japan. The Mongols tried to attack Japan a couple of times, but were defeated, actually blown back by typhoons, that is, hurricanes. Don't know where I got this little comic, but obviously shows the Mongol invaders, and the one guy saying, "My lawyer will hear about this." So the next thing we're doing is we're going into the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty, there was peasant rebellions against the Mongols in the 1300s. So a Chinese peasant involved in these rebellions established a new dynasty called the Ming, meaning bright dynasty, in 1368. Under the second Ming emperor, China occupied Manchuria all the way up to the mouth of the Amur River. And so Manchuria is north of Korea here. And of course, this map shows the expansion of the Ming Empire, and it's going to show you some other things. The maritime expeditions, it shows you in the red arrows the Japanese pirates who attacked. It shows the extension of the Ming, buffer states of the Ming, and territories that they partially or occasionally controlled as well. And then showed you some of the trading routes of the Europeans as well. Well, one thing that we need to really discuss when we discuss the Ming Dynasty in China in general is the ethnocentricity of the Chinese. There's a wonderful scholar, his name is Mark Elvin, and he's written a great book called The Pattern of the Chinese Past. He talks a lot about vast changes in Chinese economy and society, and a lot about the ethnocentrism of the Chinese. We can kind of divide the Chinese society became more introspective, more inward looking, and we can kind of look at their ethnocentricity in three different ways. One was a cultural ethnocentricity. That is, the Chinese regarded themselves as civilized versus everyone else, of foreign extraction, who they considered barbarians. This was certainly evidenced by the first emperor of the Ming, who was annoyed by incursions by the Japanese pirates. And the first emperor of the Ming, Hung Wu, wrote to the Japanese Ashikaga shogun, "You stupid eastern barbarians, living so far across the sea, you are haughty and disloyal. You permit your subjects to do evil." The Japanese were not all that pleased. They took 2 years to reply, and when they replied, they said, "Heaven and earth are vast. They are not monopolized by one ruler." End quote. Your book, Star, talks a lot about this sort of ethnocentricity, and it's a topic that we'll take up again and again. But there was also a geographic ethnocentricity, and the Chinese literally called their kingdom the Middle Kingdom. They literally thought of China as being the center of the world, and their maps showed it as such. And they not only thought that, but they thought they just had the perfect kingdom, that, it wasn't too hot and it wasn't too cold. It didn't have too many mountains. It didn't have, a lot of deserts. Those were, out in the west beyond the reaches of the, the main part of China. It also had a political ethnocentricity. And we know that the first Ming Emperor, Hung Wu, actually reestablished Chinese power over Manchuria and over Inner Mongolia and Eastern Xinjiang, even Vietnam, Tibet, Korea, and Japan were 4 places that accepted tributary status. And this tribute system was very much a part of the political ethnocentricity of the Chinese. The tribute system is where certain states like Japan and Korea and Tibet and Vietnam remain sovereign, ruling themselves. But every few years, they would send ambassadors to Nanjing, which was the capital, and later on to Beijing, which was made the capital by the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And they would bring with them, so the Japanese would come every few years, and they would bring gifts, and they would perform the kowtow before the Chinese emperor. And the kowtow was when someone would get down, literally on their knees 3 times, and then they would prostrate themselves. That is, they would take their forehead, and their forehead would touch, they'd bend over, and it would touch the floor 9 times. So 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations, recognizing the supremacy of the Chinese emperor. And they would bring the Chinese emperor gifts, presents. And in turn, the Chinese emperor, who of course was more civilized than they were since they were all barbarians and foreigners, would give them even larger, more expensive gifts in return. So this tributary system wasn't such a bad system, but obviously, and besides all of that going on, trading would go on during the tributary visits as well. But it demonstrated that the Chinese saw themselves, as the most important. They were important over these vassal states and these tributary states. They even showed their ethnocentricity when they were involved in maritime expeditions. The eunuch Zheng He led 7 maritime expeditions to explore the world between 1405 and 1433. This is long before the Europeans, headed out to discover the rest of the world. They used up to 60 vessels on these expeditions, and their ships were larger than the European ones of the day. Some people said they had 4 decks, the ships, and were up to 400 feet long and would hold up to 500 troops. The ships were designed to take advantage of the monsoon winds, which of course we talked about last week. They had compasses aboard so that they knew, what was north and south and east and west. They had double hulls and watertight compartments. And these expeditions sailed to Southeast Asia, to the east and west coast of India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa, maybe even as far as the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. They brought back all kinds of gifts, exotic animals from all of these places they visited. They brought back giraffes and zebras and ostriches to amaze the Chinese court, and all kinds of tributary agreements with all sorts of gifts. They traded along the way. Some people said that they even, got to North America and got to Europe. Whether or not that's true, there does seem to be perhaps some archaeological evidence of that. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese discontinued these expeditions. And no one really knows why. There were some economic problems going on. There was a rivalry going on between the eunuchs and the Confucian scholar officials at the time. Whatever happened, they actually erased from the historical records that these things had ever occurred. Of course, they didn't erase everything, otherwise we wouldn't know about that. But most importantly, the Chinese didn't find anything abroad in foreign lands that they needed or they wanted, that they were interested in buying. They figured that they had everything they needed to have a perfectly happy existence. The government during the Ming was a continuation of China's bureaucracy. This has already been described very well for you, and the topic is brought up in your books, your textbooks again and again, and I bring it up occasionally. The examination system, which required years of arduous study, focusing particularly on memorization, especially memorization of the Confucian classics. And of course, they had exams that you could take at the kind of provincial level and also at the imperial level. And if you passed any one of these exams, hopefully you would get a nice government job, which would pay very, very well. And you would be considered, if you passed the imperial exams, to have, the equivalent of what we would consider today the PhD, the doctorate. So Chinese always had a high regard for education. The third Ming emperor, his name was Yongle, and he moved his capital from Nanjing to the north at Beijing. And there was a reason for this. The reason was that the Mongolian tribes were experiencing a resurgence to the north. And Yongle himself would lead 5 military expeditions out into the steppes to combat this Mongol revival. And he would remain, and the Ming Dynasty would remain, preoccupied with the defenses, their northern defenses against the area of the Mongols. And in part of those defenses, the Ming Dynasty began to rebuild the older Great Wall, the Great Wall that had really gotten its start in the Han Dynasty and had been expanded in the Tang Dynasty. But this time, the Great Wall was rebuilt with strong watchtowers that used cannon. By about 1600, the wall had pretty well taken on the form that we know it today, a much more sophisticated and formidable fortification than its Han and Tang Dynasty predecessors. It was high, it was strengthened with a network of literally thousands of watchtowers that were 30 to 40 feet high and set apart about 40 to 200 paces apart. There were beacons and fortified camps, and they could fire the cannons from embrasures in the tops of these watchtowers. In the most vulnerable area across the north, in the area of Shanxi, there was even a double line of wall. And weapons and munitions were built directly into the wall as well. So this was a massive effort at defending itself, China, against the so-called barbarians to the north. Excuse me. Another great triumph of Ming Dynasty engineering was the new Grand Canal, which would connect North and South China. Remember, China's rivers generally run west-east, so having a canal connecting North and South was very important, especially since that canal could bring to the very populated North the rice from the South. The terminal point of this canal was Beijing, the capital, and its reconstruction occurred successfully by 1411 to Beijing. Another thing that the economy was known for was it was very prosperous. It saw a great deal of growth in commerce, and new crops were brought from America by way of the Philippines, which was, of course, they arrived from 16th century Spanish America. They included maize, that is corn, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, and peanuts. And the great thing about these new crops is they did not take up room from the old rice paddies. Instead, you could plant these new crops in hilly or sandy areas. Of course, the Ming Dynasty continued to produce silk and beautiful silk fabrics, which were desirable everywhere. And they continued to produce porcelain, what we now call China. Well, under Yongle, he moved the capital to Beijing. And I'm going to show you some photographs that I've taken of the Forbidden City in Beijing. So he began to build a massive palace in Beijing, and the palace itself kind of became known as the Forbidden City. I mean, it was so big, it was a city within a city, and it was surrounded by walls. And it was called the Forbidden City because, ordinary people weren't supposed to go there unless somebody had official business with the emperor, unless you were an official with the emperor. And it was the home of the emperor, and by the beginning of the 17th century, it contained perhaps 9,000 palace ladies and 70,000 eunuchs. Of course, the emperor needed to have heirs to carry on. So the idea was to have concubines, and those concubines would have sexual relations with the emperor, and sometimes they had children, and so on and so forth. And, of course, there would be concubines of former emperors who were kept around the palace, and of course they were no longer maybe concubines of the new emperor, and they were getting older and aging, but they didn't throw them out on the street. So the 9,000 palace ladies consisted of, former kind of retired concubines, current concubines, and all of the ladies in waiting, the maids and so forth that would help those ladies and take care of the everyday, making food, preparing food, etc., doing washing and the like. And then 70,000 eunuchs. Eunuchs, of course, were castrated males. And sometimes Chinese families who wanted to improve their station in life could opt to have their sons castrated, and, then maybe they would get a job at the palace as a eunuch official. Originally, the dynasties in China, the imperial government liked to use eunuchs for a couple of reasons. One was they obviously could impregnate any of the concubines. And the second thing was, since they had no children, the thought was they wouldn't be passing down their, getting their families too much involved in the government and passing down their positions. Although later on, some of the eunuchs would actually adopt children, so that kind of broke up. And the eunuchs themselves were the only males allowed in the Forbidden City overnight. All other males, real males, had to leave the Forbidden City overnight. The only male allowed was the emperor and the eunuchs. Here's another photograph of the Forbidden City. And this is along the walls of the Forbidden City as I'm leaving here's one of the entrances right here, and this would have gone out into the city itself. So you can see the massive walls that surrounded the Forbidden City itself. Well, one of the things that we need to look at is implosion. And we brought this up last week, that implosion assumes a weakening at the center or core of an empire, and at the same time, strengthening forces outside the empire, which of course can invade the empire and take over when it weakens at the core. I may or may not have used the example of, when you're a kid and somebody gives you a helium balloon, and, it lasts for a week or so, and then all of a sudden it begins to implode. And that is, it begins to leak helium. And as it leaks helium, the center of it is weakening. And then, of course, what finally brings it down is the air around it, the oxygen around it, carbon dioxide around it, which will cause it to implode. So the idea that things were happening in the Ming Dynasty, the peasants really were being squeezed. The Ming Dynasty, the population probably stood up to in the range of maybe 100 to 120 million people. There were about 130 million acres, or about half of the acreage of today, under cultivation. They generally graded the acreage according to type and productivity, so taxes were based on the quality and amount of land. And they used the double tax system, both a tax on produce, on the crops, in fall and in spring, so twice a year, double tax. By 1400, the land tax probably took anywhere from 15 to 20% of the national output of grain. In addition to that, they had a labor tax, we called it before a corvée tax. Well, the peasants will always be the ones paying most of the taxes at this period of time, and there's going to be, as well during the Ming Dynasty, famine and unemployment. And so when the peasants are squeezed, they'll begin to commend their land. The Chinese called that tu xian, which means, they no longer wanted to pay the heavy taxes, so they thought, the heck with this, we're going to head and give our land to wealthier people and live on their land, and then we won't have to be landowners and pay taxes anymore. This is all part of that endemic cycle that moves towards manorialism that I talked about last time, and is part of what happens in agricultural societies like China at this time. So there are things happening in the court itself as well. Court eunuchs, corruption and factionalism among the court eunuchs. So things are beginning to decline at the center of China. Add to that Mongol incursions by the mid-16th century, raids by Japanese pirates at the same time period. And in the 1590s, the Chinese waged a 7-year military campaign against the Japanese in Korea, which took a lot of money. And you end up with a system that is imploding. Perfect example of that is Wan Li. He was an emperor. That was his heir name, by the way. His posthumous, after he was dead, or temple name, was Shenzong. He ruled from 1573 to 1620, which was a long time, and it was unfortunate that he wasn't a very good emperor. He didn't really want to be emperor. I mean, that is, I'm certain he wanted to be emperor. He just didn't want to do really any official business. He was rather lazy. He didn't want to make, appointments to offices. He spent lavish amounts of money, one on a wedding, some $12 million for an installation of a princess, some $9 million to rebuild his palaces. And meanwhile, he increased taxes for the peasants, and officials within his imperial court became more and more corrupt. When he finally died in 1620, a 15-year-old boy took over as emperor, and he was somewhat of a dimwit, mainly interested in carpentry, and he allowed himself to be dominated by a eunuch who was a friend of the emperor's wet nurse when he was a young boy. And so the eunuch and the wet nurse really kind of developed their own spy network and army, and they recruited all kinds of opportunistic people to be a part of it. So in the 1620s, literally, a gangster regime sort of prevailed in the palace. By 1626, there were popular demonstrations in the capital. People couldn't stand any more of this, and the eunuch was actually kicked out in 1627. But it's safe to say that the Ming Dynasty never really recovered from all of this. And especially since there was a strong tribe to the north. The Manchus were tribal peoples from Manchuria, which is just north of Korea. They lived in a nomadic lifestyle, but they also lived in the zone where nomadic and agricultural lifestyles, intersected or met. So there was this kind of symbiosis or cultural interaction occurring between the Chinese and the Manchus. In fact, at one point, the Manchus became tribute bearers to the Ming court, about 75 years or so earlier. So they got a little idea of what the Chinese culture looked like, and a very powerful leader arose among the Manchus, and his name was Nurhaci. And that's an H. I'm sorry. I will change that in the PowerPoint. Nurhaci was leader of the Manchus, and he got them to work together and to develop the idea of a monarchy. He even brought in Chinese advisors to tell them all how to do this. He carried out some conquests, died in 1626, and his son would even expand the Manchurian areas even further into Korea and up into Inner Mongolia, really as far as the Amur River Valley, which the Amur River Valley really becomes kind of the northern boundary of Manchuria. Finally, a Manchurian ruler declared in 1636 a new dynasty, or at least their intentions for the new dynasty, called the Qing Dynasty, meaning pure or clear. It began to control most of northern China. But the Ming Dynasty really held on until 1644, and things got worse. There were rebels, there were rebellions, so internally things were falling apart. And finally, the capital of Beijing was taken in 1644, and the Qing Dynasty declared, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself in April of 1644. This shows you the important empires at the time: the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Mughal Empire, and in India, Tibet, of course, Cambodia down here, Annam, which is the area of what is now Vietnam, Japan, Korea, and of course China under the Qing or the Manchu Empire. And you can see also the incursions beginning with the different European colonies and imperialism. So if we look a little bit at the Qing Dynasty, which lasts a very long time, and it's the last imperial dynasty of China. It goes from AD 1644 to the revolution of 1911 and 12. A very important, in fact, the first adult emperor of the Qing dynasty, who ruled from 1662 to 1722, again a very long reign, was Kangxi. He established the Qing dynasty as really an acceptable Chinese dynasty to the Chinese people, and this was something that the Manchus were able to do that the Mongols were not able to do. And so, one thing is that the Manchus kept the forms of the Ming dynasty, the form of the government, the same kind of officials and ministers. The government officials. But the only thing they did that kind of did a different twist to it is they did a dual system. So wherever there would be, one Chinese official, they would have one Manchu official. Or if there were two Chinese officials in a department and position, there would be two Manchu officials. So they used a lot of Chinese in their administration, unlike the Mongols. And they also appointed a number of the former rebels, of the various regions, the former rebels to be a part of their system of government as well. And they did kind of set themselves off from the Chinese, trying to retain the supremacy really of their own culture. So initially they prohibited intermarriage between the Chinese and Manchus. Over the years, of course, that faded away, and the Manchus and Chinese began to intermarry. And they tried to maintain their customs and language. Although they learned the Chinese language, they still maintained Manchu as the official governmental language. And they kept themselves, the imperial clan, separate from the rest of society, maintaining really meticulous genealogies of their families. The Manchus were not to engage in trade or labor or other kinds of very lowly things. They did not engage in foot binding. One of the things that the Chinese had always found kind of erotic was foot binding for women. Now, of course, peasant women could not have foot binding done because they had to work in the fields. But, upper class women, when girls were young, they would take and literally break the toes and put the toes down under the feet, and then the toes would grow that way. And so the end result would be you'd have these women with little feet. Of course, they were, partly disabled almost for it. It would be painful even to walk, but the Chinese thought that was very erotic. That was something that the Manchus did not engage in. They did not like that. The Manchus also wanted the Chinese to adopt the Manchurian hairstyle, and this is where the queue or the pigtail comes in. The Manchurians the men wore their hair in these queues or pigtails. The Manchurians also set up a summer palace in Manchuria, presumably, ostensibly because they said it was too hot in Beijing in summer, but also, they're trying to maintain their own kind of cultural solidarity. But they did make themselves acceptable to the Chinese. They continued the imperial ancestor ceremonies of the Chinese. They built ancestral temples to their ancestors in Beijing. Just as if they were, good Confucianists. They reestablished the Chinese exam system that had fallen into disuse during the later Ming Dynasty. And so, in general, they were strong, and they built the empire. And Kangxi was one of those persons who helped to build the empire. Another very important person was Qianlong, who ruled for a very long time from 1736 to 1795. He managed to expand the territory of China, sending generals into Xinjiang, securing the Chinese hold over Tibet. And in a series of raids, he extended dominance over Vietnam, particularly the north part of Vietnam, which became a closely linked kind of client or vassal state of China. And he posted military garrisons in the regions outside, intermarried, had Chinese intermarry with barbarians and gain all kinds of trading privileges. And Qianlong also was a patron of the arts and of culture. And so he ordered the compilation of the four treasuries. So he had literally, this was like a giant encyclopedia. And he had people collect these different books. And of course, they had them copied entirely, these books. Things that dealt with classics, history, philosophy, geography, all kinds of things, up to 36,000 manuscript volumes. So quite a task. Now, decline of the Qing or Manchu dynasty is largely going to focus on implosion. And we've already talked about foreign expansion, and you can imagine how costly that was. And that involved an army, which was also very costly. And you can only imagine the corruption that was occurring. We're going to talk more about this in week 3, but particularly we're going to talk about European and other imperialism that occurs in the 1800s in particular, as the Europeans begin to carve up China. Hope that if you have any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I hope that you have a good week.